Can you hear me now? Okay, I'll start over then. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Now you hear me much better, I hope. So yesterday I was saying we worked a lot in depth into the three. Yeah, please. So among the few things that we discussed yesterday, I wanted to highlight this morning before we start is, and I'm not going to attempt to bring out all the in-depth feedback and discussions we've had. The three groups have taken extensive notes, both in relation to the scientific content and in relation to the policy brief discussion. So I'm not going to recapitulate everything now, but a few of the things that jumped up was, well, first of all, a problematization of the concept or the way in which we use partnerships as a focus of our project. We are mostly political economists, political ecologists, so we are fairly critical analysts, and yet we kind of got stuck with the partnership thing, essentially because that's what we put in our proposal at the beginning. But the way in which we are using it, I think, in the language that we use across, especially the book, we've really tried to clarify at the very beginning that by partnerships we don't mean a situation in which the various stakeholders come into an equal footing. We're very aware of power relations and dynamics, about unequal benefits, if any, that arise from these activities that we've been looking at. A second point that came up yesterday that we reiterated is the importance to look at perceptions and how these form ideas and legitimacy, perceptions and ideas of legitimacy among local communities. How do they see these partnerships from their own eyes? And of course, there is a lot of specific interest in certain people telling us particular things, and therefore we shouldn't take them all for granted. At the same time, as I made the point yesterday, we have multiple entry points into this material, and with triangulation, I think we were able to have a fine-tuned view of the differences also that are within so-called quote-unquote communities. And of course, communities are not all the same. We talk about the various uneven distributions of benefits within communities and different lenses, including, very importantly yesterday, a gender lens. So again, thank you also in any case for bringing out these important points. We talked about citizenship and about social movements, about the reflection yesterday that, you know, if these communities are so unhappy with this, what are they doing, if anything, to change or to bring pressure among other stakeholders to installate to change the situation. There was an important point about attribution, a point that we made, we took very seriously also before yesterday, but it was confirmed from your reflections. And of course, especially when it comes to livelihoods, I mean, you will see this clearly today in the assets and livelihoods presentation, that these partnerships in terms of the socioeconomic impact in these communities are fairly marginal when it comes to especially the issue of income and the issue of prosperity. And of course, prosperity is more than just where you make your money, but it does make a difference if there is a lot of activity going on in an area that, in relation to income, is relatively minor vis-a-vis, for example, agriculture. So there's an issue of attribution in that way, and there's also an issue of attribution with other initiatives that may be taking place in the same area in policy or in project or in program terms. So thank you for those. We started to discuss whether these partnerships are part of a decentralization movement or whether that is an attempt to decentralize on paper, but in practice there are strong elements of re-centralization. And this is a point that we're going to bring out again today because it's an important one in relation to the long-term sustainability of the initiatives themselves, number one, and two, in terms of the impact on sustainability, whether that is environmental or socioeconomic, in these communities. We talked about a lot about the human-wildlife conflict yesterday. I'm not going to rehash the very sophisticated and detailed discussion. I just wanted to kind of bring it back out today, including calls for a better understanding at the national level of where are these things happening and whether that is these are localized or actually much more widespread. Finally, we highlighted that there are lots of overlaps in terms of authority and responsibility for the management of these natural resources between different instruments of local government, between local government and more centralized instruments, between various kinds of partnerships that may be overlapping in the same jurisdiction, and the importance to of then reflecting upon how do we then clarify or help projects or policies to clarify who is in charge of what and where, because there's a lot of confusion on that comes from the bottom in terms of it comes in from society itself and these communities. Sorry, my voice today is gone. So these were a few points that arose yesterday along many others, as I said. Today, we're going to focus on selected presentations that bring in insights on the third part of the book that has to do with comparative and aggregate analysis. The book itself has 5 chapters on this. We're going to present 3 chapters today, one on complexity and social networks, complexity in its institutional and network components, that is better said. Then we have one on the environmental impacts and one on the livelihood impacts right through the lenses of assets. We discussed the conclusion as part of a reflection on an attempt we made to write an overall brief that is overall reflections and a few possible policy recommendations that may come out that are beyond the specificities of the 3 assets. So indirectly, we also cover the final chapter in a very short way in the final presentation today. Any other business that we may want to raise at this point before we move into the first presentation of today? I'm looking around the room. Everybody is either very happy or very tired, or both. And welcome, Faraja. Faraja Namkesa, sitting over here, one of our successful PhD students. Welcome. Could you use the mic and introduce yourself?
My name is Faraja Namkesa from the Department of Geography, University of Dar es Salaam. I'm a member of NEPSA's project. Yesterday, I was not able to attend physically, but I was online. Today, I'll be presenting the part of social network on this project. Thank you. I was a PhD student under this project also.
I see new faces among the larger group that weren't here yesterday. So maybe if they could introduce themselves quickly. Gentleman next to Faraja.
Good morning, all of you. My name is Sheikh Mataka, Sheikh Hamis Mataka. I'm chairman of the National Muslim Council of Tanzania and co-chair of Interfaith Standing Committee on Economic Justice and the Integrity of Cooperation.
Thank you very much and welcome. I'm going to spend a few minutes trying to see what's, if Lasse is having a problem in joining us. He is not online yet, and he is the main coordinator of this session. So just bear with us for a few minutes, okay? Okay, so we're in touch with Lasse, and as I told you yesterday, this is the setup here is so much better than at my university. I mean, the hybrid conferences there are always a disaster, and it's the same with the internet apparently today, because Lasse is having problems with his own internet, while we are here with really good internet. So that tells you a lot. So I can't hear you. So can you admit Lasse, please? They're all in? Okay. Lasse, can you turn on your camera and... Can you turn on your camera? Lasse, we cannot hear you.
But Stefano said they can't hear you there.
Yeah, we can hear Caleb, but we cannot hear you, Lasse.
So we could do a telephone game. You could say something, but I could say it afterwards.
Everyone else can hear me, except for you, Stefano.
No, we can hear you now.
Caleb, can you convey that to him?
We can hear you now. I have one suggestion, though. Since your internet is unstable, we're not going to try to share your desktop. So maybe one of your collaborators in this presentation could stay here where I'm standing, and when you want to go forward with the slide, you just tell them to do so, okay? Because I'm afraid that if you start sharing yours, then we're going to get in trouble because of the limited bandwidth, I guess. Is that okay?
Okay.
All right.
Sure. Sure. Okay. Can everyone hear me now? Can you guys hear me? Okay, but on my screen I can't see the slides.
Lasse, this is Esteve Corbera. I'm sitting in Lona. Yes, I think they are probably reconnecting.
Okay.
Yeah. Here they are.
Okay. Because I have no problems with my internet this morning, so I'm curious what happened. But anyways.
Don't worry, we can hear you perfectly, and we can see you at least. Caleb and myself, we can, and we don't know about Stefano and others.
Okay. So I will await instruction now, because I can't hear from Stefano.
We lost the how do you say, the venue sound now. So we cannot see them and we cannot hear them.
Okay, I'll just...
Okay, Lasse, I think
Hey.
we're ready here now. Please go ahead.
All right.
Okay. So I really apologize for this delay in this presentation on social networks and complexity. As was mentioned earlier yesterday, one important component within the NEPSIS research project was to study not only the components of the governance components of the partnerships that we set out to study and their complexity, but also to study the ecology of organizations and stakeholders around the partnerships, which are part and parcel of the context in which they operate. So can you please go on to the next slide? So the way we started this was actually to have a training session in Dar es Salaam with the NEPSIS team, people coming down from Denmark, to spend a few days at the University of Dar es Salaam, where we went through basic methodological tenets of social network analysis to enable different research team members before we were going into the field to participate in the data collection process. Now, why are social networks important for sustainability governance? Just a brief motivation here. First of all, research suggests that effective network structures promise more efficient and equitable natural resource management. And there are also studies that suggest that they potentially support local buy-in, and that there is better social learning when you have dense social networks around natural resource management systems. More generally, studies indicate that when networks are really dense and overlapping, then there is internal group cohesion that occurs, and this may support management quality and environmental outcomes, because it improves trust and information sharing, etc. But also that bridging between different groups may be important for effective information flows and learning. So there are various theories that talk about the role of networks in terms of information sharing and knowledge sharing, but also resource exchanges within natural environmental systems. And that was obviously part of the motivation for us to look at the local networks within the study sites. Please move on to the next slide. So as I mentioned before, we had a training session back in the early project where we did a 2-day workshop at the University of Dar es Salaam, where people participated, and I gave some introductory lectures to what social network data is, how you best collect it, and some of the key challenges also in collecting social network data at the local level, because this is quite an arduous task. So after that workshop, data collection began, and the different teams from the 3 case studies started going into the field. And so 3 different sources of data were used to construct these local networks. Note that we collected network data for all the study sites, right? In order to compare them both within the different cases, natural resource cases, but also in order to be able to compare across cases. So what we did was to basically map out the network of each study village, plus the focal governance organization within that natural resource field in the region. And the way we did that was to hone in on that actor, and then to trace the formal organizational collaborations that actor had but then also to trace the links of the connections of that actor. So if you think about the study village, we would follow connections from the study village, but we would also track the connections of those connections, so to speak, so that we would get this, what we call in network terms, an ego network of the study village and its structure. And so in order to map out this ego network, we triangulated information from 4 different sources. The first source was the village guest books, because as we went to the field, we realized that villages have these guest books, and any visitor to the village has to sign into the guest book. So by looking back in history, we could see what organizations had visited the village. It could be different donors, WWF, also different types of government organizations or firms. So this was one source for tracking information. Note that we map these networks over time as well. So we have different time periods, 2000 to 2004, 2005 to 2009, 10 to 14, and 14 to 18. So we had to track these relations back in time, which was also quite an arduous task. But we could go back into these village guest books and look historically. And then we looked at policy documents. So say it's around the activities of the MCDI. In the case of Kilwa, there are tons of documents about funding from different donors, collaborations with WWF, both with respect to the MCDI, but also with local villages. And so we would track these relations back in time. Websites similar to policy documents we used. And then finally, we interviewed the village environmental committee and the village councils, as well as other villages in terms of these collaborations. And now I want to give the word to, if we can go to the next slide. I want to give the word to Pili, because the way we set up this analysis is basically that the 3 PhDs, Pili, Faraja, and Ruth of the project, were the instrumental people in the field collecting most of this data. And so they also use this data in their PhD thesis, and now they wanna distill some key findings from the network analytical component of their PhDs. And then towards the end of the presentation, I will come back and draw out some main comparative conclusions for the network data across the 3 study sites. So I give the floor to you.
Yeah, thank you,
Pili?
Lasse, for the nice introduction and for presenting methodology part to show how we collected the social network data. And now I present the case of forest, the forest work package. We also did the social network analysis to map different actors that are involved in forest management in the Kilwa district. Forest management in the Kilwa district, it involves a wide number of different actors that are ranging from government, non-government organizations, business actors, and research institutions. And by using social network analysis, we were able to map more than 108 actors that were directly involved in forest management in the Kilwa district. As shown here in the map, there are different actors that are involved in the forest management in the Kilwa district and have used different colors to present different categories of actors that are involved in forest management in the Kilwa district. For instance, here, the blue color represents the blue color here represents the business organizations that were involved in the forest management in the Kilwa district that are dealing with the timber trading. And we have the yellow colors that represent the 8 villages we just shared yesterday that are involved in that have CBFM projects. We have the purple colors. This shows examples of donor agencies that are providing support to local NGOs involved in forest management directly or indirectly. And there are also government organizations that have been presented by red colors. This also provide some support, like administrative support to local NGOs that are involved in the forest management and directly to the villages that are involved in forest management. So this shows, this gives a clear picture of hectares that are involved in the forest management in the Kilwa district, but specifically or more particularly in the studied villages. There may be more hectares in the Kilwa district, but these are based on the villages that we studied, both the CBFM and the non-CBFM. However, we found that there were variations in the number and type of hectares that are involved in the forest management in the Kilwa district. And you can see from these two figures here, this is represent the non-CBFM villages, and you can see the number of ties that are linked to the villages and some hectares that are involved in the forest management, whether directly or indirectly. But in the CBFM, there are more ties between hectares that are involved in the forest management. And we have found that there are more hectares and more ties in the CBFM as compared to non-CBFM. And the villages, for instance, in the CBFM villages have more links with the various hectares, business hectares, non-government organizations, and also government organizations as compared to the villages in the non-CBFM villages. They have less ties and less connected to, have few connections to some hectares that are involved. And you can see from the CBFM villages, there are more donors that are providing financial support to local actors such as NGOs. You can see, for instance, here MCDI, there are more donors that are like EAT. We have the US United States Forestry Service. There are ADAX and ORIX, which are providing financial and technical support to MCDI and other local NGOs that are involved in forest management in the Kilwa district. There are also research institutions such as universities, University of Suez, we have University of Dar es Salaam, University of South Eastern Anglia, who are also involved in providing technical support to local NGOs and engage in research within the communities in the studied villages. And okay, thank you. Yeah, and there are more NGOs that are directly involved in forest management in the Kilwa district. For instance, we have WWF, we have MCDI, we have Mjumita. All these are involved directly in forest management in the studied villages. But when you compare it with non-CBFM, you may find that there are few non-government organizations. For instance, Aga Khan foundations. We have TCRS, this is Tanzania Christian Refugee Service, that are involved in providing humanitarian support. And some of these organizations were involved in providing, in supporting community services and infrastructure, but not directly in forest conservation. Although they have positive impact to the local communities through the provision of education. And yes, this is about non-government organizations. There are more organizational in CBFM as compared to state-controlled villages. And you can see here in state-controlled village, only TFS and the Kilwa district are the main operator. And we know that TFS is been given a mandatory to manage forests that are not under CBFM in Kilwa district and other regions. Should I continue? It's okay. Okay. Should I continue? Okay, so I was just showing the differences between network of hectares between CBFM and the non-CBFM villages. You have seen here in the map provided that there are more hectares, whether they are engaged directly or indirectly in forest management in Kilwa, in the studied villages as compared to the villages in state-controlled. And you can see here there are more hectares that are engaged in business, in timber business. For instance, we have Sound and Fair. These have been shown by the which color that? Blue colors. For instance, Mahmoud International. We have.
Billy, in the interest of time, you have to wrap up.
Okay.
Note that you only have 5 minutes each of you.
Okay, thank you. Just move.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have just move to the next slide. These actors play different roles in forest management in Kilwa districts. Most of these actors, some of them are providing financial support, for instance, the donors, and we also have some actors that are engaged in supporting local communities to establish and implement community-based forest management, for instance, MCDI, WWF, and Njumita, and they're also involved in providing technical support to the local community, for instance, trainings and awareness programs. And some of the funds are also used to empower local communities at the local level, and have seen some impact of these programs that have been implemented by different actors, as we have discussed yesterday about the positive outcomes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pili.
Can you please welcome Ruth to continue to the next slides?
So could you please move to the next slide?
Thank you, Lasse. Good morning, everybody.
Thank you.
This is the wildlife network in Rufiji and Kilwa district, where we found that there are more than 100 actors who are involved in wildlife conservation and also livelihood sustainability. Because in the wildlife sector, there are major two things, that is to improve wildlife conservation and also to improve livelihood of local communities. These are the villages neighboring Seru's Game Reserve, where there is 3 groups. The first group is Complex Partnership, which is Mungata and Juiwangumwa Wildlife Management Areas. Mungata is formed of 2 villages, Galambe and Tapika, and Juiwangumwa is formed of many villages in 3 wards. That is Jumuiya ya Hifadhi ya Wanyamapori, Ngorongo, Utete, and Mwaseni. And also the other group is Simpler Partnership, where there is Bomaminjika Wildlife Management Area. The villages we studied within Bomaminjika, WMA is Ngalambi, and Kandawale villages. And also in wildlife sector, we have the third one, which is control villages with no partnership. These control villages are Nambunju and Itawi. As we see you see the graph, the network in Rufiji and Kilwa district, yellow color is representing villages such as Mloka. Mloka is within Juiwangumwa, and Ngorongo village is also within Juiwangumwa. But Mloka village is connected to many hotels and lodges because of the location of these villages. Is near to Seru Game Reserve, but on the entrance of photographic zone, where the village council have entered into partnership with 2 operators to operate business at the village. That's why here Mloka village has a lot of connection as compared to other villages, such as this one, Kandawale village. This is not in WMA, which is operating. Kandawale and Ngarambe villages, these are the villages which are on Bomaminjika, WMA in Kilwa district. The Bomaminjika did not take off because of different things, such as there was conflict on the border between Game Reserve and the villages. That's why this WMA is not on operation. But we have Ngorongo. Ngorongo village is here, is connected to the district council, which is the red color. The red colors here are representing the government institution, because in order to operate and to form network between NGOs and the villages, there must be the connection from the government institution. The network around the partners has more actors and is more dense. This is the network around villages that are connected to wildlife management areas with a lot of partners who were there to establish these wildlife management areas. The complex wildlife management areas are even denser than less complex, that is in Garambe and in Golongo. And most central actor in this network is the Rufiji District Council, which is connected to many actors, and they are coordinating all activities within the district. Also, Rufiji District Council has the governance role of supervising tourism business, that is photographic, on the side of Jiwangumwa, Mloka village, and also hunting tourism, which is operated at Ngalambe and the Tapika villages, that is Mungata wildlife management areas, and they are connected to donors, NGO, and business companies. Contrast to forest case, where NGO, which is MCDI, is the most central. Mloka is the most connected village because of location near to the entrance of photographic zone in Seru Game Reserve. Mloka also is connected to over 25 hotels and lodges, and other villages have few or no tourist accommodation. The villages that are, for example, control villages, Nambunju and Itawi, these villages has no any business, any tourism related business. Although wildlife appears in the village land, in this control village, that is Nambunju and Itawi, but there is no there is no any connection with network of actors related to wildlife management. This is the end. I'm now welcoming Faraja to continue with the coastal resources case.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruth.
Okay, I will take you through coastal resources to look on actors and their network since 1995 to 2018. Like other resources, coastal resources also had several actors. We found NGOs, government institutions, business actors, and the other actors as we categorized together with other group resources. So we compared the actors network in MREMP and in BMU to see which type of collaborative governance initiative had more actors and what implication these actors had in sustainability outcome of coastal resources. We found that MREMP had more actors than BMUs. There are NGOs, there are donors, business actors, local communities that are colored with yellow. Green is NGO. The red color is government organization or institution. The purple is business, and the light blue is research institution. So this actor operated in Marine Park at different periods of time. They performed several activities, and they range from technical, financial, research, consultants, and other or training or awareness raising to the local communities. So MREP had more funders or donors when compared to BMU. As you can see, the blue color, I say that it indicates the funder or the donor. So for MREM, most of these funder or financial institutions were there. Most of them were there at the early phase when the MREM were established. But later on, they started to phase out, and the NGOs and the research institution and the other actors were taking more part in these governance initiatives. So financial roles were more performed in the initial phase of establishment of this collaborative governance initiative in both MREMP and the BMU. However, in MREMP, more funders were available. So after mapping these actors in both beach management unit and the Mnazi Bay Marine Park, we found that the Mtwara District Council, that the big dot green, the red one, this one is Mtwara District Council. It has more connection. Almost all actors are connected to Mtwara District Council, and this is because it performs administrative role. So each or every actors had to report to this, to Mtwara District, so that the actor can proceed with other governance activities in place. Also, MREMP has more actors. MREMP is this one with this color. It has more actors when you compare with BMU. So this is it's more central than BMU, meaning that it has more connection with actors, and therefore it is capable of getting more resources that can be used in managing the coastal resources, and therefore having more resources, it means that it can be capable to result into sustainability outcome. The assumption that with more resources, it means that you are capable of performing other duties in managing the coastal resources. So BMU had less actors compared to Mnazi Bay, the MREMP. In case of village, Msimbati is more connected when you compare with other actors. They are not seen here because with less connection, it means that the dots get more smaller. So this one which is visible, it means that they are more connected with other actors. The larger dot, it means that more connected, and when it becomes less, it means that it is less connected. Kimwamu, it is a local NGO. Here we have Kimwamu. It is an NGO. This is an umbrella of local NGO in Mtwara. It is also more connected when compared to other NGO. We have here WWF, and the Kimwamu had been there performing various activities on coastal resource management by raising awareness, supporting fishers with training, and also with loans and the fishing gears. So it has been operating there, and it has been capable of finding or connecting with other actors, and therefore accessing resources that it used to support this local community to have the fishing gears and the other resources. So,
Faraja, I think you have to start wrapping up.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Mkubiru village is less connected when compared to Msimbati. The connectivity of these villages is based on their geographical location, and also the government is also important in connection of these actors. As we have seen that MREMP is more connected, like different from BMU. So this is because the Marine Park is government-led institution, and therefore it has a capacity to attract other actors and access resources from those actors. So thank you. This is what we have from the coastal resources. Welcome, Lasse, to proceed.
Thank you so much, Pili, Ruth, and Faraja, for drawing out some of the main findings from each case study. So apart from these individual using network data for the individual case studies in order to understand the sort of ecology of stakeholders and actors around these partnerships, and the dominant collaborations going on, we also use this network data to compare across the different resource areas. So in this slide, I show you a graphic where we develop a sort of composite index of network complexity based on this data, and it involves a number of measures about the network structure at the level of the study sites. And so we aggregated these up for the control sites, for the simpler partnerships, and for the complex partnerships, to assess whether the more complex partnerships in a governance sense also had more network complexity to it. So that was one of the research questions. And in this graphic, we can see to the far left, if we look at all three sectors at the same time, and we have on the y-axis the network complexity index, we can see that in fact the more complex partnerships in terms of governance also have a higher network complexity than both the simpler partnerships and the control sites. But we also see that there is quite a lot of variation across the different resource areas. So we find that yes, institutionally more complex partnership villages have substantially higher network complexity than villages with no partnerships, and also villages with simpler partnerships. But there is a lot of variation across the different sectors, and as Pili, Faraja, and Ruth also showed in their presentation, the centrality of the focal actor, the type of focal actor that is most central in the network, varies a lot across the different sites. So for Kilwa, it was the MCDI as a sort of focal NGO, and in the two other cases, the most focal actors were government actors. So we also saw some variation in terms of the network, of the organizational composition of the network. Please move on to the next slide. So here we look at the trajectories of the different villages over time for the three resource areas. And here we can see that entering more complex partnerships commonly entails prior significant network building. So before entering these partnerships, it seems these villages start building their network. So it's not that the causal chain is that they enter these partnerships and then they build networks, but it's a co-evolutionary process, right? In some villages, there is consistent growth in network complexity, and in other villages, initial growth was followed by stagnation or slight decrease after entering more complex partnerships. So again, in most villages, we saw growth initially, followed by either stagnation or further growth after entering more complex partnerships. No partnership villages were generally stagnant in terms of their network complexity trajectory. Next slide, please. Yeah, and here we summarized the complex and simple partnerships in terms of low network complexity and high network complexity. So we categorized low network complexity as those below the mean, and high as above the mean. And villages that end up with a higher network complexity also tend to be those villages who have entered more complex partnerships. But this is not a deterministic relation. There is also some crossover of simpler partnership villages that have developed higher network complexity, and some more complex partnerships that have failed to do so. Thank you. Next slide. So concluding remarks. So we have very different network histories of study villages, but also across the different resource areas. But growth in network size and complexity preceded institutional complex partnerships, and this is a more or less general finding. But the partnerships also contributed to further growth of network complexity. And so one big question, of course, are these network structures associated with environmental and social outcomes? And this is a question that we will deal with in the next session. And thank you everyone for listening. And I'm really sorry for having taken up so much time and for the technical problems this morning. Thank you.
Thank you. I've been asked to chair because it's a bit easier for me to do so than rather Lasse sitting on his side. So I'm going to chair from here so I can also have a better view of the chat. I would like to invite everyone online to write in questions if they have any. But before we move to the discussion, I would like to introduce our discussants. As a matter of fact, Beatrice Crona doesn't seem to be online. I tried to write to her, but I haven't heard. So in any case, we'll start with the people who are here. And in particular, I would like to welcome Fransen, who is an associate professor of international relations at the University of Amsterdam. He is a member of the Political Economy and Transnational Government Research Group. He has a PhD in social sciences from the University of Amsterdam, and he's held research and teaching positions at the European University Institute, the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Studies, Yale University, Leiden University, and the Amsterdam Institute for International Development. So Luke's research interests include the politics of corporate social responsibility. He wrote a book on that, on sustainable development in global supply chains and private standard setting, transnational civil society activism and international organizations. And one of the methodologies that he is really good at is social networks, and that's one of the reasons we invited him. He's also a member of our advisory group, of our academic advisory committee in NEPSUS, and so he's been helping us since the beginning. His ongoing projects include one on labor standards in global supply chain and one on transnational advocacy networks and the challenge of anti-NGO regulation. Luke, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Stefano. Thank you very much to the author team. Let me first check whether you can hear me, given somewhat of the back and forth. Yeah, I love thumbs. Give me thumbs. Very nice that I can join in this manner in this wonderful event. Many thanks to get new insights from this wonderful project. What I'm going to do is say a few things about the presentation that I heard and the chapter that I read, which was chapter 8 of the book draft that the authors shared with us. And I think I'm going to do that first, basically from a position of admiring what is being done, and then also saying a little bit about the opportunity or the possibility that in the future, when this book is out, that it might be that some people draw on particular chapters and read them relative isolation to what the broader book project is about, because obviously all the chapters fit into a bigger narrative, and ideally you want readers to read from cover to cover. But as is current academic life, it very often happens that people basically hone in on the chapters that they like most, and you can basically think of my comments also as a way to let the presentation that we've just listened to also be sort of a piece of art that can work on its own, that people can admire for its specific qualities. So what I very much liked about the presentation that I just heard and about the chapter that I read is that it is rich in empirics. I was very impressed by the data gathering going on. I thought the move to focus empirically in terms of understanding nodes and ties on these guest books is wonderful, as it allows also for something that social network analysis nerds always get crazy about, which is mapping change over time and looking at different points in time at what networks look like. I think it also gave a very rich view of what sort of the network politics of resource management and a partnership building look like. And maybe the first thing to note, which was a comment that I wrote down yesterday when I'd only read the chapter, is that as it often goes with social network analysis, you, as an academic, you put it to the task of basically describing one particular narrative in a chapter or presenting one particular narrative of an analysis in a presentation. But at the same time, there's so much going on in these graphs, in these networks, in terms of information provided. And it's often such a waste to just leave it with only that one narrative that you can provide in a chapter or in a presentation. So I'm happy to hear this morning that a lot of this stuff is also going in separate PhD projects, which from my understanding means that you can dig much deeper into some of the substantive implications of what these graphs tell you. And one of the things that I was thinking of while I was listening to the 3 empirical sections of the presentation just now is that, for instance, there seems to be a very interesting pattern emerging in terms of the type of organizations that make up these networks and that have particular politics going on between them. One of the things that I'm fascinated by, for instance, is how funders, big funders, donors relate to NGOs, relate to governments, and all those graphs tell a little slice of a story of, for instance, donors, big funders, having a particular place in those networks, having a particular presence in these villages, and therefore also in a network sense, developing certain economic power relations and network power relations towards other actors. And that is one of the things that could be explored on the basis of this empirics next to everything that's going on in this chapter. So what I just want to encourage people in the room is to basically think of this as a really rich reservoir of things to build on in order to understand the politics of development and of sustainable development much better. When it comes to the particular chapter, there's a couple of basically, cosmetic recommendations I'd like to make that have to do with how the argument is now set up. The chapter reads really well. It's a nice piece to read, and it starts off with a very good literature review, I think. But in terms of pitching the argument, it seems in the first half of the story really to lean on notions of bridging and bonding and trust going on in networks, whereas the latter half of the story tends to focus exclusively on complexity dynamics in terms of complexity in governance and complexity in networks. And then the story about bridging, bonding, and trust seems to recede into the background, at least for me as a reader. And I'm not so sure anymore how the complexity story then relates to that introduction. That's the first thing I'd like to note sort of as a reader of the chapter and as a listener to the presentation just now. The second thing is that I like also the literature review in terms of its discussion of institutions, as in relation to networks, in relation to organizations, in relation to partnerships. But obviously the difficult thing is here that these words sort of overlap in terms of describing particular empirical phenomena that you want to plot, because organizations obviously are also institutions and partnerships are also networks in a sense. And I'd like to encourage the authors to look through those particular sections very carefully once again to basically establish whether they are fully clear on which particular part of empirical reality that they're describing refers to what particular concept that they're using. In particular, when it nostrum understanding is still a very sort of broad concept. Is everything still going okay in terms of our interactions? Yeah? Good. I'd hate to talk to a wall and hear after a couple of minutes that I was offline all the time. Another thing I was wondering, and I was happy to hear when Stefano introduced sort of the discussion of yesterday, which I had to miss, is that you were referring and reflecting on the concept of community, right? And what it means and how you can think of it. And what I was just wondering in the context of this project is whether for this broader project, you basically use this notion of a community as a given, or whether it is also something that you, in network theoretical terms, want to examine as something that exists or doesn't exist. Because obviously that is something that network theory and also the network methodology allows you to do, basically establish whether a community actually has community properties. And that was also something I was wondering as I was reading through this particular chapter, where that particular aspect of sort of people and organizations belonging to each other wasn't unpacked that much further. And I think that's basically it in terms of what I'd like to bring to the table. Like I said, I want to encourage people to do as much as possible more with these kinds of data, looking at different kinds of questions that you could use to draw out more interesting dynamics that are already implicit in some of the findings and the figures that were shown. So I thought this was all very interesting and inspiring. And thanks so much for that.
Thank you so much, Luke. Thank you for your attentive reading and your comments that push us in the right direction, I think, in terms of what kind of audiences we engage and what we take for granted. So that's really really helpful to have somebody from the outside, although you have known the project, to look into this way. I'm looking around the room to find out, to elicit some questions in relation to this part of of our work. Okay, I have a question over here. And for the sake of those who are online who may not have been here yesterday and may not know you, could you introduce yourself and then ask the question? We're waiting for the microphone, and then I think there will be somebody getting the camera on them as well, so you can see online.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for a very good presentation from the team. My question is that, oh, yes. My name is John Richard Mbwambo, forest ecologist from Tanzania Forest Research Institute. Yes, thank you for the presentation. When listening to the presentation, there is something that wasn't very clear, and I expected it from Faraja, who talked about the implication of the networks, and that was not clear. And I would like to ask whether could you comment on the degree of complexity on improvement of conservation of the three resources, that is forestry, coastal resources, and wildlife, whether more complex networks have better conservation outputs and compared to less complex. That is my question.
Thank you very much. I think that this group may start to answer the question, but we actually have a session coming just after that hopefully will give you some of the answers, where we connect complexity of the two kinds with the environmental outcomes. But the first part of the question, I think they may be able to address it when we go around the round of answers. I had another gentleman back here. Again, please introduce yourself.
Thank you very much. I think Richard preempted my question because assume that this piece of paper dropped somewhere and someone pick it and read as a separate. And then he will have a lot of questions related maybe what has this network, for example, contributed to whatever may be balancing between conservation and the benefits people would like to get. Is they increasing the win-win or there a lot of win-lose, something like that. But you said there is another, and it's in the form of books. Maybe it's okay, but a little bit to introduce that one could get a lot of benefit into the paper.
Thank you so much. I'm looking around the table here. Gentlemen over here, again, please introduce yourselves for the sake of people online who may not have been here yesterday. Thank you. And then I have another one after. Then we'll wrap this round, go back to the presenters, and then do another round afterwards. We're going to go 15 minutes past in order to be fair to this group since we started late.
Yeah, okay. My name is Abdallah. My question is almost similar to what the one who has just asked. I would like to know all these actors, to what extent their intervention in their presence in those areas has either contributed, whether supplementing or complementing or sometimes even duplicating the effort. Because it happens that, okay, a number of actors go into the area with their intervention, but if you're not careful, they may end up duplicating the effort rather than supplementing or complementing.
Thank you very much. We have another question from Matthew Buki back there.
Yeah, so thanks for the presentation, Lasse, Faraja, Pili, and Ruth. So my names are Matthew Mabele, and I'm from the University of Dodoma. So my question actually relates to what Luke pointed out about the notion of community, because as we have seen in the three sectors, communities are actually not the central actor as we expected, because you're talking about community-based conservation approaches. So my question, or sort of a comment, is for the group to reflect on what does that mean for community-based conservation approaches, but also going back to what Charles said yesterday, the issues of decentralization. Charles and William said yesterday. So what does it mean for the so-called community-based conservation approaches? What does the project bring in terms of such a thinking, which is the dominant thinking? And why the community is not the central actors as you expect from these approaches?
Thank you very much. I have Esteve, who has a hand up, so please do pose your question from Zoom.
Should I use the Zoom then? Should I use the chat or just talk?
Just cast a question since you're on.
All right. Okay. So my question is about the controls, in fact. So who are these controls, and controls in relation to what? I mean, who was identified as controls? Just give me more information about that so that I can also think in relation to the cases. Thank you.
Thank you, Esteve. I don't see any more hands for the time being. I think I would like to give the chance to the presenter group to reply. Lasse, would you like to start?
Sure. First of all, thanks a lot for your great comments, Luke, and to also all the great comments and questions from the room. Sorry I couldn't be there. Yeah, so there was a number of great questions here, and first of all, thank you, Luke, for pointing to maybe some of the more terminological problems in the chapter that we that I hope are not too confusing. I think the point about what community means here is a really interesting one, because of course we study these local village communities, but in network terms, a community is a less formal thing, and is something that you derive from the observed relations, and so on. So that's a really interesting idea, I think. So to John on the relationship or the association between the complexity of these different sites and the conservation outcomes, I think I will simply defer to the next session, which really is going to look into this this much more. But I will say that one shortcoming that we found of this composite index of network complexity that we developed for these comparative purposes is that we've developed for for the purposes of writing research articles, we've developed some, I think, better measures of the central variations in terms of network structure across the different sites. And one thing that has to do with is how much sort of, you could say, how much network closure. So the extent to which actors that connect with each other also connect with their partners, and also, and especially variations in terms of how many private sector organizations are part of a network versus how many NGOs. And these are one of the central varying parts that we have found matters quite a lot in terms of conservation outcomes, especially for the forest case. So is there presence, is there duplication efforts? I think I would defer to Faraja, Ruth, and Pili here about whether the presence of many organizations are complementary or duplicate. I wouldn't be able to answer that. And then I didn't hear your name. Was it the guy from Dodoma University? You mentioned that we're talking about local communities, but that the communities are not the most central actors in these networks. And I would kind of say that's not quite true, but it could come across like that from the presentation. So I apologize for that. But that's simply because the actors that have a regionally coordinating role will tend to become much more central because they collaborate with or coordinate across the different villages. So in some way that is a natural role of being a coordinator, is that you accrue many ties, right? So that doesn't necessarily mean that the communities are not central. It's sort of a correlate of the way we measure things, that we map the networks of all the local study sites, but we also mapped the network of the focal, as it were, partnership organization at the regional level. So so that's more a correlate of the measurement methods. And then finally, Esteve asked about control sites, what they were, and it varies slightly from resource area to resource area. And I don't think we have time to go into the details, but in principle, the control sites were villages where there was no sustainability partnership whatsoever. So so that's not quite true for all sites, but that was the principled logic, at least. Thank you. And maybe we should give Pili, Faraja, and Ruth a chance to respond to any questions that they might have.
Thank you. Faraja?
Okay, thank you. Someone asked about the implication of this network in sustainability outcome. We presented a part of network analysis, which has a link from other chapters. And yesterday, there was a presentation from the coastal group. And one of the outcomes from the availability of these actors, it showed that there is more conservation benefits in the area than other benefits. And our network analysis showed that most of these actors perform the technical role. And this technical role, we say that they include education, awareness raising, research, consultants. This means that they imparted the knowledge to the local community about the conservation issues. That's why in the finding that was presented yesterday, it showed that the benefits that has been there or has been observed by the local community is conservation benefit than any other benefit, because in our network, funders or financial activities were less compared to technical role. To what extent the presence of the area, the presence of these actors in the area had complemented or duplicated the efforts? In the case of coastal resources, we found that some efforts has been duplicated, whereby we found that this support from actors, various groups of fishing groups were given support by every actor who were going there in the studying village. So we found that those few people were benefiting from these actors in the network. And this has been due to lack of clear channel for communication on what has been taking place in the area, to what extent has been achieved after the actor has been in the area. And we interviewed some officials in the district, and they said that there is no this memorandum of understanding when the actor go there to perform or to implement certain projects on conservation issues. So some activities are performed or are done in the area, but they are not documented to the extent how these activities have been beneficial to the local community, or the goal of this project has been achieved, so that the other actor can take more or other activities to do or to perform in the area. So I have that. Thank you.
You very much, Faraja, or rather Dr. Namkesa, since she is successfully defended recently. And now Dr. Pili Silvano.
Oh. Okay, I just want to respond to one question that was raised, whether the presence of actors contribute or supplement each other. We found that there are different actors that are involved in different sectors, forestry, coastal, and they have different interests. As we know, that some are involved, interested in business, in timber trading. Others are interested in conservation. Others are interested in providing humanitarian support. So there are always conflicting interests, as we presented. For instance, yesterday we show how MCDI is mostly involved in sustainable timber harvesting, while TFS is mostly interested in generating income from the forest. So sometimes these kind of actors, they conflict because of their own interest. And in some cases, we found that these actors, they complement each other. For instance, in providing technical support, such as trainings to the local communities, we found that, for instance, MCDI, WWF, and UMITA were collaborating to provide this kind of. So you may find sometimes they are collaborating in supporting local communities, but sometimes they also have their own interests. So even though they are supporting local communities or supporting each other, but sometimes they are conflicting. Yeah, that's what I can say from.
Thank you. Last but not least, Dr. Ruth John.
Thank you, Professor Stefano. I'm responding to the question from John Richard, that implication of the network degree complicity if there is improvement of resources because of the presence of many actors in the villages. For the case of wildlife, at least if you compare in wildlife sector, the villages that are in wildlife management areas with a lot of actors in the villages and control village with no partnership in wildlife conservation, you found out that the villages that have agreed to establish the WMA, at least the presence of many actors has shown some improvement of wildlife conservation, because communities have received a lot of training and a lot of training from WWF and GTZ in collaboration to improve their livelihood through opening different projects, even though the project collapsed after the end of WWF, but at least local communities are aware what is the meaning of the wildlife conservation, because they have a lot of people who are informers and watch the wildlife. If the wildlife are killed, they are reporting direct to the authority. So these villagers are aware of wildlife conservation, and they observe all the activities in the villages and they report. But when you go to the villages with no WMA, you found that there is a lot of illegal activities because the villages first, they have not received enough training on wildlife conservation, and they are not in the wildlife management areas. They don't have investors who give them money or who pay for tourism business. And when we were doing research in these villages, we started by signing the guest book. I think you saw the guest book there. When you sign the guest book, you are able also to see other people who are visiting the villages. So you found out that the villages that are in complex partnership have a lot of NGOs and other institutions who are going to the villages to support them to improve their livelihood. While the villages in control villages with no partnership, the village is silent. For example, Tawi village, we visited Tawi village where we found the village is very quiet. We went to a place called Kikobo. The village was very silent. Even there is no road going to the village. We tried with our Land Cruiser to go to that place and to see what is happening there. So even if the wild animals are killed, there is no report and there is no one who cares. I remember when I was going to Ngarambe village, I called a person, a primary school teacher, who used to accommodate me there at the villages because there is no guest house for the visitors. So I used to go to a primary school teacher who accommodated me. I called her and asked her, what should I buy? Because I was going from the town and out to the village. I asked, should I buy meat? She told me, no, don't buy meat, because when we cook meat, they will confuse us with the game meat, and this one will be the problem. So you just come with tomatoes and beans and whatever, because when we eat meat, these reporters will report to the game rangers, and this will be a problem. So that is the difference. But when I went to Control Village and slept there, there was a lot of activities going on during the night hours, a lot of bodas moving from one place to another. Then I asked the village chairman, why there is a lot of activities in the night? He told me that there is magendo, a lot of illegal things going on in the night. That is the difference which I observed. Thank you, Professor Stefano.
Thank you, Dr. John. Now, should I say Dan or Professor Brockington at this point? I don't know. So Dan is going to make a last contribution to this discussion, then we have to wrap up and move on to the next session. Dan, you're on.
Thank you, Professor Ponte and Doctors John, Silvano, Faraja, Kilamucha. Look, this has been a very interesting discussion, and I am struck by the fact that when I listen to colleagues in the room in NEPSA's talk about the substance of the interactions between these institutions and the actors, there is a lot of colour and detail and diversity. And I don't quite see, and this is my problem, but I don't quite see how a quantitative network analysis captures the detail of these interactions. But I want to be persuaded. So I wondered if Lasse or other advocates of quantitative social network analysis could convince me that the numbers, or can show me how the numbers complement the more qualitative analysis to which I'm used to. Because I would love to be convinced. I've done social network analysis with Esteve, and I see a lot of promise there, but I want to know how the quantitative approach can capture the qualitative detail.
So obviously, last question, you dropped the bomb. So I don't know, Lasse, you wanna give a 30-second spiel from a social network analysis response, but we really need to move on.
So I mean, I've had 5 or 6 years now to convince you, Dan, and we obviously haven't succeeded. So I'm not sure I can in 30 seconds. But two things. I mean, first of all, quantitative network analysis can never replace or replace the qualitative substance of the interactions going on. And I think the stories from Ruth right now, but also from Pili, when they talk about these stories, those are not insights that flow from the network analysis or the structural network analysis per se. What I do think network analysis can tell us about is the extent to which there is presence by organizations outside the study site. So simply the density of the ecology of organizations involved in these sustainability initiatives. But then also the extent to which these organizations also collaborate and coordinate on different dimensions. So we've looked at stuff like financing and funding, technical advice, formal governance relations, and so on. And I do think we can use these numbers to talk about the extent to which there is collaboration and coordination, not just across the organizations that work with the study sites or the villages, but also the extent to which the villages have engaged these relations over time. And that speaks to stuff like knowledge sharing, information sharing, but also the extent to which there is a sense of groupness around these quite complex partnerships involving lots of organizations. And I think some of our quantitative findings linking this to conservation outcomes hopefully is testimony and evidence of this. But the quantitative measurement of these relationships can never replace these qualitative accounts of the interactions. But hopefully they can complement them in important manners. But thanks for the challenge, Dan.
It wasn't a challenge, it was a genuine question, and thank you for a fantastic, detailed and thoroughly convincing answer. Thank you, Lasse.
Thank you very much, everyone. I would like to commend the presenters and the audience and the discussant for this really good discussion. Please give them a hand. Thank you, Luke, for making time in I know you're busy with teaching today and a lot of other things, so thank you for making the time. Unfortunately, Beatrice didn't show up. There is a chance that she understood that this was 9 o'clock Swedish time, so she may actually be coming in half an hour when it's 11 o'clock here. And if that is the case, we'll allow her after the next session maybe to give us the feedback. I don't know if that is a problem. I'm just guessing because I haven't heard from her on email as well, either, I mean. So let's move to the next session 11 on environmental outcomes. The chairperson is Caleb, but because he's in the US and it's very early in the morning or late at night in his place, they've asked me to continue chairing this session. Also, unfortunately, Kelvin Kamde, who is really the engine behind this work, is not well today. So Dan has kindly offered to step in parts of the presentation. But I'm going to ask Dan actually to introduce the two discussants for today because they're very good close colleagues of his. So here he comes. And then Caleb, we're going to run the slideshow from your side. So maybe you could start sharing the screen while Dan does that. Thank you.
Thanks, Stefano. Yes, it's a pleasure to introduce the discussants to you. We have Esteve Corbera, with whom I've worked for quite a few years now, based at the independent Autonomous University of Barcelona, and who is managing a large number of quite important projects at Barcelona, including his own iCrea Fellowship. He's just a wonderful colleague, and he has worked on forestry issues and environmental change all around the world, but in particular also in southeast Tanzania, and we've been using his data and his research to help to understand what's going on in our own study sites. So it's a great privilege to have him with us. And of course, Professor Kathy Homewood. Excuse me if I begin to genuflect when I introduce Kathy, because she is my PhD supervisor, long-term mentor, guide, and simply wonderful person. And it is a great privilege that we can have her as well joining in the discussion, because she has been working on environmental change and wildlife politics and ecology in Tanzania since the late 1970s, and has written landmark publications since that time, including Marshland Ecology, which came out in the 1980s, but has also been producing the most extraordinary data sets involving thousands of questionnaire survey results and exploring the work of wildlife management areas, which are all in the public domain and an extraordinary resource. Caleb, I think it's over to you now.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody. It's nice to see all of you again, for those that I've seen before, and it's nice to meet all of you that I haven't met yet. Thank you for taking the time here. I'm really a relative newcomer to the project, so I'm gonna defer to Dan in particular on local context. I'm sort of the has computer code will travel person. So my job is to sort of talk about some of the methodological tools that we've been using to try to answer some of the questions that came up in the previous session about what actually are the connections and the impacts on the ground of some of these different types of initiatives. Like Stefano said, I wanted to emphasize a tremendous amount of this work was done by Kelvin, and his expertise in remote sensing is absolutely critical to this project, and you'll sort of see as we get through the places where I'm going to have to do a little bit of hand waving about exactly how Kelvin did his work, just because it is such an important part of this that is in his skill set and less so in mine. So I'm just going to jump right in as a continuation of the previous session to sort of say how we went about trying to assess these environmental outcomes. And so, the limitations are always that you're limited by what things you can observe. And so often we're trying to use proxy indicators that we're hoping are more or less correlated to underlying ecological quality, right? In some cases, the measures are pretty direct. So when we're looking at the case of forestry, we're trying to assess, how are different partnerships and how are network characteristics affecting preserved forest cover. So in other words, are they sort of slowing forest loss in the areas where they're active? We actually use the same measure in the case of wildlife. Here, we're sort of trying to use it as an indicator of protected wildlife habitat. That's not as ideal as if we had very high resolution population studies of particular species that covered large areas, but of course that's not available. We take a similar approach in the case of coastal and marine resources, where we're looking at coral areas and mangrove areas. So here again, we're focusing on habitat, and we're focusing on all of these things from a habitat perspective, primarily because those are the things that we can observe at high resolution from a satellite. And that's really where Kelvin came in and working with the satellite data to help us get the materials that then went into these models. So what I'm going to do for the next couple of slides is hand this over to Dan for a little bit of comment on the sort of aggregate patterns that we see across the country, a little bit of the context, and then we're going to zoom in on the quantitative results for our study areas.
Thank you, Caleb. This is Kelvin's work undertaken at the University of Edinburgh with Casey Ryan and Sam Bowers, his postdoc. And this is the work that I was talking about yesterday, where Kelvin was able to do a 3-month internship with Casey. And quite remarkably, given...
Just moving this so that we can actually see it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. And given that Kelvin was yet to get his PhD at that point, yet to enroll on a PhD, and Sam Bowers is a postdoc, and Casey a world-leading expert, he found his feet very, very quickly, was able to undertake quite remarkable analyses using radar data, which provide very good indications of change in forest cover. And in addition to looking at the normal measures of deforestation and degradation, which are depicted in red on the right-hand side below, and overlapping those with various different protected areas, as we can see, he also included measures of afforestation and reforestation, which are often omitted in some of the analyses. And we did that in order to understand better the context of deforestation nationally and forest change nationally, so that we could see how the study sites fitted in with a more general picture. Casey rang me rather excitedly when this work was first done, because he realized that there, in some parts of our study sites, there were hotspots of deforestation associated, he thought, with increased sesame cultivation, which would be stand out nationally. Could we move on to the next slide, please? Caleb. And then just to underline the fact that in the study sites itself, there is a mixture of deforestation and degradation, but from the graphs, which are not quite visible on the screen before you, we can see that if you look at the right-hand side, the single most largest column it shows actually unchanged land. Unfortunately, Caleb, on our screens, on the screens I can see that the x-axis of those graphs is invisible. But I can tell you that on the left-hand side is deforestation, thank you, and then the one in the middle is degradation, and then the middle right is no change, and then the far right is afforestation. There we go, thank you, Caleb. So we have some patterns, we have more degradation and deforestation than afforestation, and we have more more degradation and deforestation in Lindi than in Pwani, so in the south rather than the north. And most areas are indicating no change. And you can see that in Lindi, there, where the red dots are associated, these are outside the study villages and associated, I believe, with increased rice cultivation around irrigation areas. Caleb, do you want to move on to the next slide from? And I think this is you.
So, because we're working with forest survival in 2 of the cases, and in coral and mangrove survival in the coastal resources case, I'm going to split the discussion here to talk first about the forest cases. Then I'll hand it back over to Dan to introduce the coastal case, and then we'll talk about the coastal cases. So in order to try to attribute some sort of forest protection to either partnership complexity or network complexity, we needed to operationalize those variables. And so the previous presentation sort of talked about how we came up with the measure for network complexity. And then, of course, all of the previous presentations have talked about the division of the partnerships into different complexity levels. And so if we're thinking about what we're trying to do in trying to attribute effects on forest protection to these different partnerships and network structures, we're really trying to model these relationships, controlling for a whole range of geographic determinants that would make an individual parcel of forest more likely to be felled, right? So things like the slope of the land, overall elevation, proximity to cropland, since we're also talking about areas where there's some shifting cultivation, proximity to human dwellings. All of these sort of geographic characteristics could affect the probability that a forest patch could be felled. There's also a problem in estimating the effects of governance complexity because those same control variables that are likely to affect the probability that a patch of forest gets taken down are also likely to affect the attractiveness of certain places to become protected areas. And so this is something that's well documented in the literature, trying to assess the impacts of protected areas, that they're often located in places where you might have lower deforestation pressure in the first place. And so we had to have a way to deal with that problem. And so what we adopted was a technique called propensity score matching. And so what we use are these control variables that affect, that we would expect to affect the probability that a particular patch of forest is felled. And then we use a machine learning technique to try to equalize those variables for areas that are in national forest reserves or village livelihood forest reserves or wildlife management areas or other game reserves and open access areas. And so by using this machine learning technique, we're trying to move things a little bit closer to what you would want to get with a natural experiment. And that kind of helps us deal with some of these inference problems. So to take you through a little bit of the data creation process here, hold on just a second. Dan, I'm going to mute you if that's okay. So this is really where a lot of the work happened, and this is where Kelvin came in. This is where he was working to identify forest change over time using satellite data, mostly from the U.S. Geological Survey's Landsat array. So what Kelvin would do is identify forest patches in the field, either from existing maps or from his own field work, and then collect satellite imagery for our study sites for several time slices across the observation period. Time slices differ a little bit from study site to study site, but generally we're looking at observations of about 3 to 4 years over the period between 2000 and 2018. And then he did a whole bunch of processing on those images, and using Google Earth Engine, used this tool called a random forest classifier. So this is another machine learning tool. Basically what it does is take control points that are fed into the algorithm that a human has identified as forest or non-forest or water or whatever sort of land cover classification we might be interested in, and then sorts those into discrete land cover classes across an entire satellite image. And the reason you would use a machine learning to do this instead of human coding is that any individual satellite image is going to have hundreds of thousands, millions of pixels. So you need the computer to do it for you. We take that combined with the governance data that we've been talking about and the geographic controls that I mentioned in the previous slide to feed into our propensity score matching. And then we take that, mix it with our village network complexity and our governance variables and model them using this thing called the Cox proportional hazards regression model. These models are used a lot in medicine, in engineering, and basically what they do is they try to predict the amount of time until an event takes place. So the way to think about what we're doing here is we're taking individual 10 meter by 10 meter pixels of areas that are forest in 2000, and we're trying to model how all of these different variables affect the amount of time it takes that patch of forest to get deforested. And so if it doesn't get deforested at all, then that means those variables are sort of, you know, like it takes a longer time. And if it gets deforested, say within a couple of years, then those variables are driving deforestation, right? So we're trying to sort of use this as a way to model the probability that an individual section of forest gets deforested. So if we look at forest protection, this is sort of one way to visualize how our variables, the main variables that we are concerned with, seem to be related to the probability that an individual forest patch survives. So the way to think about this is if we could imagine going into our field sites either in Kilwa or in Rufiji and going to a random patch of forest 10 meters by 10 meters in 2000, what's the probability that that forest is still standing in 2018, right? And so if that probability is higher, and we can attribute if we can attribute higher probability to certain variables, then that gives us a sense of the degree to which those variables are protecting or in some cases undermining forests. And so the way we might read this visualization here is that these are box plots showing a random sample of 25,000 pixels that were forest plots that were forested as of 2000, and then the probability that they survive until 2018 under different conditions of the variables that we are interested in, right? So if you look at this plot up here in the upper left, we're comparing an open access area to a national forest reserve. And the way we're sort of, the way you can think about this is the probability we would expect for all of these 25,000 forested areas to be deforested by 2018 if they were all open access. And this is the probability they would get deforested if they're part of the National Forest Reserve, right? So the difference between the open access and the National Forest Reserve gives us a sense of the overall effect that we're estimating, that we're attributing to protection under National Forest Reserves, right? So as you would expect, forests are a little bit more likely to survive in National Forest Reserve areas than they are in open access areas. Similarly, if we go over here, forest parcels that are in village livelihoods forest reserves are also more likely to survive than open access. And it turns out that these community-based forest management or village livelihoods forest reserve areas perform about as well as the National Forest Reserve areas in terms of protecting forest, right? So you can sort of compare the survival probabilities here. I mean, they're actually even a little bit higher. So there is some evidence here that the more complex governance regimes are doing at least as good a job as the simple governance regimes in forest protection. So if you come down here and we look at the wildlife case, we see something similar. And, oh, I just realized there we go. If we look at the wildlife case here, we see something similar. So looking at Rufiji, we find that one, the overall deforestation risk is much lower than it is in Kilwa. So all of the forest is surviving more. But again, game reserve areas are substantially less likely to be deforested than open access areas. Also true for National Forest Reserve. But what's really interesting here is that we find our wildlife management areas. So these are the more complex governance regimes in Rufiji. They actually outperform both of the government regimes in terms of protecting forest areas. So here, the more complex aren't just doing as well as the simpler, they're actually doing better. However, there's a caveat, and there are areas where wildlife management areas and the game reserve boundaries are overlapping and under dispute, right? And Ruth mentioned this in the previous presentation. And in those cases, we actually find an elevated risk of deforestation relative to open access. So network complexity, on the other hand, is a little more difficult to interpret. And this goes back to something that Lasse was already saying in the previous session, that it really depends a lot on the composition of the network. And so we find in Kilwa, higher network complexity is actually associated with a little bit more deforestation, whereas in Rufiji, higher network complexity is associated with substantially less deforestation. And we think that the reason here, it has to do with the role of private sector actors in the two networks. In the case of Kilwa, many of the private sector actors are timber firms. And this was something also that was mentioned in the previous presentation. Whereas in Rufiji, a lot of them are sort of ecotourism firms. And so one of the things that we find that's really interesting is if we pull out the organization types and compare them separately, then we find that if you have more complex networks based with civil society organizations, it is almost always associated with lower deforestation rates. Whereas if you have more complex networks with private sector organizations, it seems to depend on exactly what that private sector is doing, right? So that level of complexity is sort of important, kind of coming back to one of the things that Dan was saying about sort of the nuances of the qualitative characteristics of these relationships. So now I'm going to hand it back over to Dan just a little bit to talk a little bit about the coastal case, and we'll see this has much more sort of complicated results.
Yes, a very little bit of me, folks, because we have to change the variables we're measuring in that we're looking at mangrove